Okay, let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, it's a very exciting day that many have been waiting for. In today's event, the Science Based Targets Initiative is pleased to launch its net zero standard for corporates. So we are really excited to have you today. My name is Paola Delgado. I am the SBTi Head of Engagement, and I will be your host today. So very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before we get started, actually, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. So I want to also let you know that this session is being translated live into Spanish and Portuguese. So to our Spanish and Portuguese audience, buenos días, bom dia. Also, this is the second of two launch events that we organized for today to accommodate for different time zones. We're also glad to be joined by attendees both through Zoom and also watching a live stream on YouTube. But if for any reason YouTube live streaming is failing, we also encourage you to join us via Zoom. We have increased the capacity of the room, so hopefully there will be no problem for you to join. Also, this event is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to Zoom registrants and will also be available on the SBTi YouTube channel. The slides will also be published on the SBTi's NetZero webpage. And we will have time for questions, but only during the panel session. So if you have a question which you would like the facilitator to address to one of the panelists, please submit it using the Q&A function on your Zoom window. Excellent. Let's now go into the next slide, please. Great. So for today's agenda, we will open with an introductory message from UN High-Level Climate Action Champion Nigel Topping to set the scene. Then we will have a panel of experts from across business, science, and civil society who will be providing their perspectives on the importance of a robust corporate net zero framework. Following this, the SBTi team will introduce us to the net zero standard itself, including an overview of the standard's 2-year development process, the key elements of a net zero science-based target, and also some exciting announcements of the first companies that have their net zero targets validated by the SBTi. We will then hear as well from one of these companies directly. So GLL will share how the SBTi net zero target setting process works in practice and more. And finally, we will close the event with a short wrap up and a call to action. So without further delay, I'm pleased to share the opening message from Nigel Topping, the UN High-Level Climate Action Champion. And this message will actually be followed by a short SBTi video that we have prepared for this launch.
Hello, I'm thrilled to welcome the new net zero standard from the Science Based Targets Initiative and like to applaud the leadership of the SBTi in launching it. We know that as well as long-term targets, rapid and deep emission cuts are essential if we're to achieve not just net zero, but stay within our carbon budget and keep temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees. Because the latest climate science from the IPCC is very, very clear. The UN described this as a code red for humanity. But that science does show that it's still possible to limit global temperature to 1.5 degrees if we act with real urgency, because we're very close to that threshold already. Now, I'm thrilled to see the SBTi's new net zero standard as the first framework for corporate net zero target setting in line with climate science. And this net zero standard is now providing a common, robust, science-based understanding of net zero. It's an easy phrase to say, but as you all know, there's some nuances that are crucial to getting it right. This will give business leaders the clarity and the confidence that their near and long-term decarbonisation plans are aligned with climate science. We know that rapid action to contribute a fair share of halving emissions by 2030, as well as getting to net zero by 2050, are crucial for companies to align with the net zero standard. And the great thing about this standard is that it will ensure that companies are aligning both their near and long-term science-based targets, and again, across all scopes. Another really important point. We need every company to take this responsibility, not just in their own operations, but across the entire value chain, in order to achieve the changes needed to keep 1.5 degrees C alive. The rigor of the Science Based Targets Initiative has been at the heart of the Race to Zero, which Gonzalo Munoz and I launched last year. And it's that rigor which has allowed the momentum to grow really fast, so that we now have well over 6,000 businesses, cities, investors, regions. And this new standard will extend that rigor and provide much needed credibility behind corporate targets and claims of Paris alignment, as well as guiding business short-term action plans. I invite all companies across the global economy to commit to set these net zero targets, which the Science Based Targets Initiative will begin validating from January next year. We need all companies in this race to a better, greener, more resilient future. And we know that this standard can set them on the path to achieve that.
Excellent. So just a quick reminder before we move on with the agenda today. This session is being translated live into Spanish and Portuguese. So if you want to hear to Spanish or Portuguese, please first go to your meeting webinar controls, click interpretation, then click the language that you would like to hear, and then please optional to hear the interpreted language only. Click mute original audio. Anyways, these instructions were posted in the chat box in case you would like to listen to the session into Spanish or Portuguese. Okay, well, it's time to kick off our panel discussion, and we have convened an amazing group of people to have a discussion about the importance of net zero for the corporate sector. And we have the pleasure to have Patrick Frick from the Global Commons Alliance to moderate this panel. So thank you very much, Patrick. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Paola. I have never, ever gotten so many beautiful hello messages within a couple minutes. I mean, has anybody an idea that this must be the hundreds? And the countries present here, the cities you're coming from, this is absolutely beautiful. I think if you're on YouTube, you can see this chat box literally exploding for the past couple minutes. So hello, everyone out there. Well, and then thanks for Nigel for the introduction. I will just stress some of his messages again and highlight them for all of us. But before I go there, we had a session earlier in the day, equally incredibly well attended. And what I said there at the beginning still very much holds true. I actually never thought that I could get so excited about something called as SBTi net zero standard. Now, why is that so? Well, first of all, the science is in, we've heard it. Last IPCC report called the sixth assessment report has confirmed that unfortunately, climate change has already hit every region on Earth. And also now, I think the impacts are so visible, right? Extreme heat, floods, droughts, forest fires. You don't need to be a scientist to understand kind of what's going on here. So as Nigel said it, this is a threat for humanity, unfortunately. And if we want to protect us and life on Earth from the worst impacts of global warming, we must hit net zero by 2050 and on the way have emissions by 2030. Pretty simple, right? But it is so close. I mean, we are talking about a little bit more than 8 years from now. And unfortunately, we are not on track at all. So from that message, let me go back to the excitement and why I'm excited about the SBTi net zero standard. Well, the reason is that it enables business to do what it takes to get to net zero. This new net zero standard is the world's first framework for corporate net zero target setting in line with climate science. And the exciting news is that this means companies can now set verified net zero targets consistent with limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. This launch is really well timed. I mean, we are not sure at all. I don't know how you feel, but I'm not sure at all what our government representatives will commit to next week and the week thereafter. We'll cheer them on for sure, but business can send a strong and I think hopeful signal by committing to SBTi's net zero standard en masse. And that prospect makes me hopeful. So we are all glad to see the standard because it provides clarity and ensures all of you who work for a business and embrace the standard can be confident that you take actions that are in line with climate science, and it will get us to where we need to be. Let me just stress that this standard has a focus on rapid and deep emission cuts already within the next 5-10 years. So this is not pushing the job out to 2050. We have to get going right now, which is essential to achieving net zero. So today, at this critical moment in time, I have the pleasure to hold a conversation with experts from science, academia, and business, including actually the first companies that will receive formal verification for their science-based net zero targets. Congratulations. So I do have with me, and I warmly welcome our speakers. I have Doreen from the College of the Atlantic. I have Emily Hickston from the B team. I have, again, thank you, Michael, for joining us. Again, Michael Hugman from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIF. I do have Nora Singh from PepsiCo. And then lastly, I do have Carol Kopczynski from Inca Group, IKEA. So before we get into it, for everyone who's joined us, I foresee this conversation to cover two parts. First, of course, I would like to hear from our panelists if my enthusiasm and my hopes for the standard are justified and why so. So why do we need to commit to net zero and why is the standard necessary? And then second, I would like to hear from the speakers about how do we get the job done. We're at the very beginning. In the morning, someone called the first chapter in a book with many chapters, but I would like to have a conversation now about how we get the job done. How do we implement the standard? How do businesses plan to get to net zero? So let me start with Doreen, just to create some sort of same of understanding, some shared language. And the first question I have for you, Doreen, is why is it important that we keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And what are the consequences if we exceed that? Not maybe just by a degree, maybe even more. So over to you, Doreen.
Yeah, I think it's thanks to SBTi for the opportunity to be here with all of you, and thanks, Patrick, for tossing me that first question. 1.5 degrees. Well, so one way to answer that question is to ask the question of why is it in the Paris Agreement? Because it's a critical component of the Paris Agreement of setting a target for well below 2 degrees, but really trying to achieve 1.5. And why is it there? It's because there are countries that are vulnerable for which 1.5, anything above 1.5 is an existential threat. It's an existential threat for small island developing states that may find themselves underneath the water with sea level rise. It's an existential threat for vulnerable countries who are significantly dependent on agricultural production and for whom cyclones may be devastating, droughts devastating. So that's one way that I would answer the question of why 1.5. And another way, and this gets to the consequences. What are the consequences if we don't? We're already at about 1.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And I mean, if you watch the climate news from around the world, you know that this year has been unprecedented in terms of droughts, in terms of cyclones, heat waves, wildfires. And this is just at 1.1 degrees of warming. Every 1/10 of a degree, every little bit of warming from now on will have more and more sort of exponentially growing consequences. The consequences of temperature rise are not linear. They're sort of exponential. And we're getting close to some really dangerous tipping points. So every 1/10 of a degree from now on matters. And that's why countries of the world said well below 2, but scientists are really not at all sure that, they know that 2 is way too hot. And that 1.5 is really what we should be striving to stay below because of those magnifying consequences.
Thank you, Doreen. And that's the worrying part of the conversation. We'll get on to greener grounds or greener grass shortly, but the tipping points, Doreen, that has me also seriously worried, right? Because the temperature you're talking about is average. We're seeing some of our global commons like the Arctic ice sheet exposed to even much higher temperatures. And so losing these buffer zones almost that serve as carbon sinks, it makes me very worried. Doreen, can you just help us clarify what we then mean by net zero? So if you'd like to get to net zero by 2050, what does this mean?
Sure. Another key definition to set out from the start. When I think about net zero, I think about those two terms. I think about the net and the zero. And I think that we need to emphasize that the zero is the substantive part. We need to get to zero or as close to zero as possible. That requires deep, rapid, urgent decarbonization. But we also recognize that decarbonization will never be absolute. We will never get to absolute zero. For example, the production of food will require us probably to have some emissions. And that's where the net comes in. The net recognizes that there are ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. the most talked about these days is through ecosystem restoration, because as you restore ecosystems, you grow trees, you make habitats more alive again, you're bringing carbon out of the atmosphere. But, and here's where the relationship between net and zero is really critical. There is limited removal capacity. There's limited ecosystems, there's limited places for us to draw down carbon, which is why I'll go back to my first point, zero is really critical. But those two pieces together, that's what net zero is. And that's why, that's why the standard is so critical of really sort of now taking this concept of net zero, which is very sort of theoretical and conceptual, and trying to figure out what does that actually mean in practice. And so the SBTi standard really focused on the zero, which is really critical, keeping us focused on the prize of zero, recognizing that at some point in the future, we need to talk about net and the residual removals that will be critical to keeping temperature below 1.5 temperature.
Yes. Very, very helpful. Thank you for clarifying that for us and your explanations. Can I just ask you about this question around speed? 2050 sounds so far out, but I understand we have a cap on the carbon budget. So why do we need to get to action very, very quickly?
You're right to draw attention to the carbon budget. It depends on, what degree of certainty you'd like to stay below 1.5. The IPCC says that I think it's an 83% chance of staying below 1.5. We've got about 300 gigatons of carbon left. If carbon dioxide left that we can put into the atmosphere, and if our annual emissions of carbon dioxide are over 40 gigatons a year, it means that if we just keep going full speed ahead with emissions as usual, that budget is exhausted this decade. It means that this decade is the critical decade to act. 2050, as aspirational as these 2050 targets are, they're meaningless. They're meaningless if there's not action this decade. We're at 1.5 if we don't act this decade.
Doreen, that is very, very clear. Thank you. Now, I'd like to go to Emily and just ask, well, why, Emily, is corporate climate action so critical? And of course, from the B team, you do have a bit of a cross-sector, global view. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Patrick. And it's sobering to go after that description from Doreen. So let's take that question head on. Why is corporate action so critical? And mainly it's because that we need to respond to the world that Doreen laid out. If we breach this 1.5 barrier, the tipping points that will create, the impacts that will leave for the next generation. And we need to answer the calls of the young campaigners, the Friday for Futures campaigners that are on the streets every Friday, who will be shouting at us from those halls of COP26 next week, and will be saying to the business community, we need you to step up. And that chorus is getting louder and louder. It's true that we are seeing huge momentum around net zero from the business community. That needs to be celebrated. But we're also seeing at the same time, I think, a growing amount of skepticism about what this community is really doing. And that is why the net zero standard is so important, because it's going to say, this is what we mean, this is where we're going, and we're gonna get back on track. So I think there's two broad answers. Why is corporate action so critical? The first one is, of course, the private sector is part of causing climate change. I don't think I need to labor that point. Everybody that's turned up to this call knows that we need to be part of the solution here. It's obvious the private sector emits a large amount of carbon across all sectors. So we need to tackle that head on. And we also know that we're moving too slow. every day this week, it seems, and the last few weeks, it seems there's been a different report out about progress on climate, how we're not on track. There was one this morning from the New Systems Change Lab, which analysed that progress in the power sector, agriculture, heavy industry, transportation, none of it was going fast enough to achieve 1.5. So we know we're not on track. We know that there was a dip of emissions during the global pandemic, which of course in many countries is still carrying on, but we know that those emissions are fast rebounding. So we have to act, and we have to act fast, and we should talk about pace later on. But broadly, why do we act? Because we know we can do it. As I just said, the momentum is growing, the solutions are getting there. We're seeing a huge amount of countries committing, and we just now need to see kind of those real enabling policies coming underneath those net zero targets, but they're coming. And we know, of course, that corporates are also making those commitments. And we are seeing that with growth, say in the solar and wind industry. It's growing 15% annually over the past 5 years. We can see change, but we need to grasp that change now as the corporate sector.
Thank you, Emily. I mean, basically, we're running out of excuses. So let's get to it. And Emily, this earlier session, there were quite a few questions that popped up. I think there was a lot of eagerness to get going. Okay, let's move on this. And then there was this question around, well, then I talk to my board, I talk to my senior leadership. So the questions around like, what's the business case here? I mean, how can we already equip people on this call who want to move with some arguments for why there's a business case for moving right now?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on this point, so let me just make a few. And of course, it varies from company to company, but the business case is definitely there, and it's getting stronger and stronger. So firstly, I think we are seeing a fair amount of demand signals. So good examples of that are obviously campaigns like EV100, which are kind of aggregating all of these companies that want to demand electric vehicle fleets. We are seeing that demand signal there. And we are seeing that replicated from sector to sector, to steel, to renewables, of course, as well. And a lot of companies are also even willing to pay the green premium for green products. So we are really seeing momentum there. The green premium is no joke. It's very difficult, especially for SMEs, to think that they can afford that. But the prices are coming down all the time, as I said, around that 15% annually of global share of renewables kind of increasing and knocking out coal. We can see that demand is there. I think there's another case for first mover advantage. Obviously, the Teslas of the world have shown us that. And I think companies that can really get out there and grasp that, easy to say, difficult to do, I know, but that's really true. And of course, reputational benefits. Every person of my generation and the generations to come want to work in a sustainable company. And so that talent and retention point is really important too. And quite frankly, the risks are getting higher and higher. The risks are being left behind, not only by your competitors, but by your suppliers that will start putting pressure on you, by your customers. Companies will need to be able to demonstrate what they're doing to stay on track for 1.5 to get to net zero. And of course, the last point I just make here is that regulation is stepping up. Is it good enough? Not yet, but there's a lot of regulation that's on the cards from, of course, those net zero targets from the EU to all G7 countries committed to net zero. And then we're starting to see that enabling policy. And we're really hoping for good signals out of the G20 this week on ending coal finance, potentially on fossil fuel subsidies. So that enabling policy is coming and companies need to get ready for it.
Great, Emily. I want to build the bridge over to Michael. Michael, so corporate action is critical. How much could actually corporates, if they all move, right, help us address the problem? How much could they take on of this challenge?
It's a great question. And so I think really just to support and add to what Emily has said, our partners at CDP and at SBTi have done some brilliant research using the unique data that they gather, and it transpires that more than 35% of current global emissions are directly due to companies. So that would what we would describe as scope 1 and scope 2, the actual production of emissions in processes or through energy use. When you expand that and you take in what we refer to as scope 3, so supply chains and customers, for companies globally, that share of emissions rises to well over 80%. So the reality is, and it's just really reinforcing what Emily has said, we will not progress anywhere close to the pace that Doreen has set out for us unless the corporate sector is absolutely front and center of this transition. And I think, just to finish, Patrick, one of the things that I think is powerful and exciting about the framework as the SBTi team have designed is that short-term action with the interim targets, creating that urgency, focus particularly on scope 1 and scope 2, which is where companies can really act today, and investing in renewable energy, electrification, all of the things. These technologies are widely available, they're increasingly cheap. I think the last few months has shown, frankly, if we were investing more quickly in those technologies, we'd have a more stable and secure global energy system than the one that we have that is reliant on very fragile systems like gas. And then the framework builds out to scope 3 over the longer run and exactly matches that journey that we need companies to go on, because that's what's going to give us that 85% of global emissions.
Michael, let me just repeat this. Over 80%, if we conclude scope 3, could be tackled by companies. So that is a massive opportunity. I mean, if we get the corporate sector to move, that is unbelievable. So let me just ask you then, Michael, another question, which is, so why is it then important that companies embrace the standard?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the direction of travel, and again, you're really supporting what Emily has said, and we're seeing all key stakeholders really focus on the transition, and that's just going to impact companies in so many different ways. There is regulation coming. It's accelerating, and we're going to see more of it. I think we're going to see a move towards more mandatory climate transition planning. The Spanish government, for instance, in its new climate law, it has already mandated large companies to produce 5-year climate action plans. Frank Elderson from the ECB spoke just 10 days ago about needing to move towards mandatory climate plans for Eurozone banks, because how else is the Eurozone and the European Union going to deliver on those government targets? We're going to see customers wanting to buy from companies. We're going to see pricing of carbon. So companies need a framework that is really linked to science. And what is unique about this framework, and I'm not going to subject people to the detail, but it is brilliant that this framework is built on the IPCC scenarios and other work by organizations like the IEA, which actually takes us towards the carbon budgets that Doreen has set out. So this framework is critical because it's the one that gives you that linkage to science. It gives you that interim target and that short-term framing for the detailed action plans that companies are going to need to produce. And we know this is, also about government and policy. And as companies create those plans, it will help to drive policy. And this framework is also, I think, the critical way for companies to really be able to transparently demonstrate to all of those stakeholders. And as you know, Patrick, I'm a former investor, particularly the investment community wanting to engage with companies, it's through this framework that you'll be able to transparently show your commitment, your plans, also your progress in reducing emissions in line with science.
Thank you, Michael. Nora and Carol, I want to hear from you clearly on how do we get this done. But before we go there, is there anything from your perspective, like you are at a corporation, is there anything you feel like adding why this standard is important? Nora, may I invite you first?
Sure. Yeah. And I think Michael and Emily laid out pretty well in terms of why a standard is important. And I think initially when SBTi started in this journey and put out, their foundations paper, it was laid out pretty well in that paper in terms of companies, eager to join and have a net zero target, but then having not having a standard was really the pain point in terms of knowing exactly what to do. And so the net zero commitments that happened prior to the launch of the standard were all over the place, and we're trying to do the right thing, but not really having the guidance to do so. And so I think with this standard, it's really laid out pretty well in terms of what is the framework for companies to be in line with science, and what is the framework for companies to focus on the important areas like emissions abatement and emission reduction first, and then think about how do we want to balance the rest of our emissions when we achieve that net zero state. So I think the standard really gives us that linkage to science, gives us the confidence that we're doing the right thing, and therefore is really important for aligning, and standardizing corporate action in this area.
Thank you, Nora. Carol, anything to add?
Yeah.
On that note from your side?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for invitation. Thank you, Patrick. I think many good points were said. I think that what I can just add is that these standards, it's creating the trust. It's creating the trust between individuals, governments, and companies, because we can start to align the actions we are taking, make them so we can compare them and trace and see what is actually happening. And I think this trust, it's so needed within the current world and the situation, because we need more trust to act much more together as well. So first of all, like big congratulations to Science-Based Targets, and I think to all of us that we have this standard, and it is an important milestone, especially on the way to COP.
Thank you, Carol. And Nora, I want to remain with you. Thank you for mentioning that term trust, because in the earlier session was this notion of, oh my God, this is probably the most challenging, daunting transition humans have ever to go through in human history. Like, how do we get this done? And so I guess we need to wade through a lot of complexity, but if you, Nora, and Carol just could help us understand a bit, what are some of the steps you're taking? So what are some of the first steps you're taking that'll get us at least on to this journey? Nora, might I invite you first?
Yeah, certainly. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a big challenge for us all as companies to get there. But I think getting started is key. And I think Dorian made the point really well that, we have to act, and we have to act now. I think what has helped us, and PepsiCo has had, climate targets for, well over a decade, since 2010, and we set our first science-based target back in 2016 when the SBTi, first came into existence. So we've been working on this for a while, and within our own operations, and I think it was mentioned earlier that your own operations is where you have the most influence, the most control, and so there's a lot there that we've already done and have made significant progress in that area, and have become pretty savvy in terms of how to think about our emissions and reduce our emissions within our own operations. I think supply chain scope 3, as I think all companies will tell you, is the challenge. That's where most of our emissions lie. For PepsiCo, over 90% of our emissions are in our supply chain. And so because we don't have a lot of control and influence, some influence, not a lot of influence in that area, it's about engaging with our supply chain, our value chain, really. It's about influencing and making sure that our suppliers, our value chain partners come on board in this journey. So what I would say for companies who are contemplating this or contemplating even having a target for climate is to really, take it one step at a time. First understand your emissions, figure out your footprint, figure out the drivers of your footprint, then lay out a plan. Identify those reduction levers that you need to pull in order to make that progress. So taking one step at a time and thinking about sequencing. There may be some things that are big and impactful, but maybe the technology is not there today. It will come online later on. So thinking about sequencing your activities as you make progress towards that target is also important, and that also helps you kind of get started. So I think that's what I'm.
Thank you, Nora. Carl, from your perspective.
I think, first of all, you need to understand your impact. And as Emily said, we are all part of the problem. And to be part of the solution, we need to understand what is our impact. So you need to, as a company, we need to understand our scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions and where they are coming from. Then to define what are the solutions to tackle these emissions and reduce them. And in case of IKEA, it's first of all electrification, renewable energy use across the value chain, and energy efficiency improvement. The second is about transforming into circular business model and promoting sustainable consumption. And the third part is about materials, so using materials with lower climate footprint, for example. But then when you have done already these parts, then you need to move as well into assigning as well responsibilities and see where different parts of emissions should lie based on the responsibilities. So if within, for example, retail part of your business, when people are operating the store, they should have responsibility for what kind of energy is being used and what is the impact from the waste generated and so on. The part of the organization that is responsible for supply chain should be working as well with the renewable energy use in the supply chain, for example. So the third element, it's assigning as well responsibility within your business. And then as well, it is about commitment. It's about investment commitment. And from the Inca perspective, that's why it was so important that we invest in renewable energy. And we just committed next 4 billion euro to invest within the renewable energy use to enable the renewable energy use, not only within the retail operations, but as well in the wider supply chain. And if your board is not on board when it comes to climate targets, show them the climate risks. And then it's very clear that when it comes to the scenario which were mentioned by Dora, the not positive ones, companies are not able to mitigate the risks. So this will impact very heavily the business. And then when you look on the more decarbonization scenario in 1.5, you see that with the right investments, you can actually capture new opportunities which are coming with this transformation, as well as reduce costs. And probably that's where I will stop.
That's great. I mean, I like to hear that business pragmatism, how you walk us through these step by step. Let's just take a step back. And Emily, what are some of the challenges that haven't yet been mentioned that we will face in reaching net zero, and how do you think we can overcome these?
Wow. I mean, I think quite a few of them are just touched on by Nora and Carol there, weren't there? Particularly scope 3. And that's what the SBTi, through their public consultation, came up again and again. How are we going to accurately measure scope 3, and then how are we going to influence companies in our supply chain and our customers to reduce their emissions? And I'll come on to some thoughts about how we overcome that. I mean, of course, also challenges on the table are the need for new technologies, that need for reducing the green premium, and also ensuring that we have the public support for these quite radical changes that are going to be needed to be underway. But I think that there's a lot that can be done, even without some of that enabling policy that I mentioned earlier. And I think there's a couple of ways that we overcome those problems. So firstly, as everybody's just said, Carol just said, step 1, of course, set targets measure, figure out where your emissions come from. And that is why we need this net zero standard. That's why the SBTi set out methodologies for being able to record emissions across your scopes and then setting a plan to reduce them. And let's, because it hasn't been mentioned here, let's just say this works. We know this works. The SBTi put out their progress report early in the year showing that for the companies that set targets, on average, they reduced their emissions by 25% between 2015 and 2019. So that's 302 million tons, 78 coal-fired power stations. We know this works. So that's the first step, of course. That's how we overcome the challenge. There's other things I'd offer as well. Radical collaboration. Companies, you can go so far alone, and then you're going to need to collaborate with your peers and, of course, cross-sector as well. And I think a really good example of that at the moment is the Mission Possible Partnership, where we are seeing sectors come together and set out strategies for getting to net zero. And more than that, then saying, right, what does that tell us about the technologies that need to be invested in, the demand signals that we need to generate, the markets we need to generate, and of course, the policies that need to be in place in order for us to really kind of strive and kind of get on pace. And that leads me to my kind of second point, which is business needs to advocate for those policies and needs to advocate responsibly. So I won't say any more about what the policies are, but I will say that in order to overcome the challenge to get to net zero, companies need to ensure that they are not lobbying in the wrong direction. And we do see examples of this again and again, particularly where companies are setting science-based targets and are committed to the Paris Agreement, but are members of trade associations that are lobbying the other way. So it's a real plea that we need to overcome the voices in the industry that are lobbying against the enabling policy that we need to get to net zero. And then the last point I just make here, because I think it hasn't really come up yet, is that we need this to be a just transition. We need to ensure that our workforces and communities are on board with the transition. So that means kind of enacting with them. That means having social dialogue to figure out what the plan is, and then enacting those plans with them. So we need to build that trust that the transition will provide good jobs, decent jobs, will provide a more inclusive economy than the one that we have today. And we need to invest in that process. So that deep decarbonization target that you're going to set through the SBTi should be communicated and worked through with your workforce and your communities.
Emily, that is such an important point. I mean, thinking of that transition not really impacting, many lives is just really not smart. I mean, this will have a massive impact on many parts of the population. To think about how we get this done fair and it feels just is equally important to reducing CO2 emissions. I would like first Michael and then Doreen just to see, is there something that you'd like to add in terms of how do we get through this transition with really ambitious timelines, right?
Yeah, just briefly, I think to reflect what Emily's laid out so eloquently, it's going to require a level of partnership across so many different sectors and institutions, more than we've probably seen in many ways. And what this framework does, I think, is it provides that basis for partnership, because it provides that transparency about what is being committed to, what that journey looks like. So partnership between companies and government to get the right policies in place, not to be, saying one thing and lobbying the other way. Partnerships between companies and the financial sector. This is my background. Creating that framework within which companies can then deploy business strategy, CapEx, and finance that. And it all sits within this framework. This framework provides the foundation for those kind of partnerships. And it goes on as again, Emily's mentioned, partnerships within sectors, between sectors. All of those rely on a clarity on what for an individual company that journey looks like. And I think that is the only way that we're going to meet this incredibly high hurdle of ambition that we have. And just make one last point, Patrick, quickly. it also pertains to other instruments. I see some of the questions coming through about things like voluntary carbon markets. Again, there can be an important role to play there in the use of those markets, and then partnership there, supporting capital flows to nature-based solutions, but it's got to be transparent. Companies first have to be abating their emissions in line with Paris before they can even begin to think about any of those other steps and making those other claims. And when we think about partnership in just transition, I think this framework is going to also provide an incredible basis for companies in low and middle income countries to build partnerships also with development institutions and others. Again, it's that transparency for then funding to come in. So it's all about partnership, because that's what the framework provides.
Thank you, Michael. Doreen, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I started off with a pretty sober story about where we're at, about what we understand about the science and what we understand about the scope and the scale of the challenge ahead. And I would say, you know, as somebody who spends a lot of time in climates, thinking about climate science and interacting with climate scientists who are in the trenches, climate scientists are freaking out. It is, you know, we and that should give us some indication of the scale of the challenge ahead, of the huge amount of work that we have to do. I think it's essential that we understand the scale of the problem. I think it's essential that we're that we face it as difficult as that is, to sort of know the loss of glaciers and ecosystems, and you know, the list goes on and on. A couple of things that I heard that I really resonate with me, and that I wanted to add to, and one is the essential nature of trust, and I would add a word here, and that's courage. Because it's going to take brave companies doing things that are outside of the box, that are outside of what they're comfortable with, investments that their investors are not going to be happy with, that shareholders are not necessarily going to be happy with. It needs courage, because we're doing, you know, as you said, Patrick, this is we've never done anything like this before. It's the greatest challenge, I think, that humanity is facing. And I really like this concept of radical collaboration, because we have to do this together. This is not individual companies. This is not going to be individuals. It's going to take all of us working in academia, working in the nonprofit sector, working in industry together. And so I think those are the points that I would echo, that I think are really critical for us to take forward as we think about how do we get through this transition as urgently as the science is telling us we need to act.
Doreen, thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question that will require a little bit of courage from our panelists, because it's totally unscripted. Ready for that? So I'd like to know two things. And everyone in the chat can help, of course. I mean, we're a lot of people here, and I think that's the point. We're in this together. First of all, I'd like to ask you, what is it you personally will do as a first step or an action going forward? Can be after this call, can be a few weeks out, but what will you do to fix this problem? And second, Doreen, you said it, radical collaboration. Impossible to do this alone. Absolutely impossible. You just get depressed because the challenge is so overwhelming. So what's your ask for help? What would you like others to ask for? And then I hope everyone will meet your wish, and we'll meet at COP26 and make it all heard. So first of all, answer the question on what you will do, and then what's your wish or your ask for help. Who wants to go first? Michael, that's courage.
not as much courage is going to be required on the rest of this journey, but I think so. Many of you know we're a foundation that funds a lot of work in this area, and I think actually that inspiration to double down on partnership and collaboration. There's so many actors that are going to be required around this framework to make it happen, to support you as companies to do that. And I think that's one thing that I definitely take away from this is philanthropy, and those who are lucky enough to be able to bring resources to support this transition are going to have to really back this and enable everyone to try and be bold and brave about it.
What's your ask? What's your wish, Michael? Ask for help.
I think people need to join us. I think that for those on the call, in companies, in financial institutions, there's also a need to be brave and to speak truth upwards in those organizations to senior management and leadership, to help them understand why being at the forefront of the transition is actually going to be the winning strategy over the next 5, 10, 30 years. But that does require people to be brave and to come forward and then to partner with all of us in NGOs and civil society working on this.
Great, speak up. Who wants to go next?
I can go.
Everyone, that's great. Nora.
Yeah, I guess in terms of what I will do, I think it's probably doubling down on what I already do, which is, within our company, advancing our climate change agenda, advancing the work that we do, internally aligning with our partners, our business partners, our functional partners, to act and to figure out how to act, providing that sort of sense of urgency to act is, I think, what I'll probably, double down on, given the urgency of the matter. And I think in terms of, collaborating and reaching out for help, I think that's something that we do quite a bit as companies. This is a pretty competitive space where, we collaborate across the value chain. We collaborate with our peer companies. We reach out, to understand what is working and what is not working. What are the lessons that we can learn from other folks and other companies in this space, so that we can all collectively kind of move, towards this agenda. I think, this is sustainability in general, climate especially, is one space where companies are really eager to learn from each other and really eager to deploy those best practices. So I think reaching out more to our peers, our value chain partners, is something that we do and will continue to do.
Thank you, Nora. Emily?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so I think what I'll do, as I said earlier, I'll go to COP next week and I'll engage with various stakeholders, those that don't necessarily agree with us or don't trust us. Back to that issue of trust. I'm thinking the Extinction Rebellions. I'm thinking those young campaigners who don't think that net zero means, it's worth its salt. I want to engage them on what the net zero standard means, that it means consistent, verifiable targets that are going to be disclosed against. I think we need to explain that so that net zero is not synonymous with greenwashing, but synonymous with the action that is needed to get to fulfill the Paris Agreement. We've got to kind of reclaim that language and show that it's credible. So that's one thing I'm going to do. And I'm sure we'll see Extinction Rebellion in all the business events next week. So that'll be great. And then I guess, what's my ask? And this is everyone's ask. It's really around the performance data. We really want to be able to see that once companies have set these targets, that they are performing against them year on year. And that's going to be really important for the 2023 global stocktake, which for people who don't know UNFCCC jargon will be a kind of accountability moment. And I think business will need to play a big role in that. We'll need to show that we have delivered some against the targets we've set for ourselves. So we really need that good, credible performance data.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Doreen and then Carol, or Carla first. I don't mind who wants to go first. Doreen, I see you're unmuted, so please.
Yeah, I'll go. I will also sort of carry on and double down. Some of my work as an academic and as a professor is working with youth. And I think it's really, really important to lift up the voices of youth, to give youth platforms. My students know very well what the future, I don't have to teach them climate science. They already know it, right? And they're already really quite petrified, right? So to give them platforms to voice this, because though they have the most to lose, and they should be some of the most invested in the work ahead. What I'll ask for help on, getting across that net zero is about zero. Because I think, following on Emily, that this is where the credibility issue is, right? Is that so many companies want net zero, and countries too, want net zero to be about the net, to be about offsets, and to sort of sweep action on, sweep things under the rug. And zero is really sort of critical. And so that's what I need help on, is emphasizing the zero.
Then I think I'm the last one. So I think, first of all, it's to double effort on showing the good examples from the countries where legislation is not moving fast enough. Because we see, like EU, for example, we see the legislation is changing very quickly, and we see a lot of positive movements. But there are countries where legislation is not moving fast enough. So we're definitely doubling the effort on bringing the examples from the business from these markets to show that actually it makes sense and what can be done. And then when it comes to the looking on for help, I think how we can change the mindset around looking on the financial spending on climate action as not the cost, but as investment. Because this is something what we are investing for the future. The cost is only when we don't act, and this cost is too high. And when you look on the financial spending for climate action, this is the best investment we can take, and this is enable us to reduce future costs as well as develop new business opportunities. And this is what we need to realize on the big scale to move the whole financial system.
Thank you all. This has been a great conversation. I'm very appreciative of all of you coming to this launch event. I'm gonna close it, and COP26 is just a few days away, and this net zero standard offers a really clear call to action and a pathway for companies to play their part in decarbonizing the global economy. So I think we're really talking about resetting the norms for our global economy. What I'll commit to is I'll be at COP26. Will root for the SBTi net zero standard wherever I can, and hope many, and in the end, everyone will adopt it. That's when it becomes a norm. My ask is, the panelists here just shared with you what they will do. You all here, this is 1,500 people on this call. If you want to gift the panelists back, just why don't you put in your chat, as you said hello, just put in the chat what you'll do. All right, just I want to hear you in that chat. I want that chat to explode. And then I basically just going to hand it over to Paola while I'm watching the chat. So thank you all. Thank you for the conversation. Back to you, Paola.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for your excellent moderation. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for sharing your valuable insights on this topic and for getting us all excited, for sharing your key messages so eloquently. Hopefully our audience is feeling very inspired right now, as I am feeling, but this is not it. I mean, we still have much more coming up, so please stay with us. We are now going to actually hear from the SBTi Net Zero team, who has tirelessly worked over the last 2 years to prepare this Net Zero standard. So we actually will commence with Cynthia Cummins. She is our technical director and co-founder of the Science Based Targets Initiative. She will introduce us to the Science Based Targets Initiative. Then we will be hearing from Andres Chang, our research manager, who will talk about why did we engage in this effort to develop a net zero standard. Then followed by Emma Watson, our Net Zero Senior Management Manager, who will talk about what is a science-based net zero target. I think actually I skipped first, it will be Paulina, who will be talking about how was the SBTi net zero standard developed. And then finally, we will have some acknowledgements and appreciation and a call to action from Cynthia. So hopefully I said it in the right order, but we will hear from our wonderful team. So Cynthia, over to you.
Hello, everybody. So now I get to tell you, just give you a little background on the Science Based Targets Initiative. Next slide. So the initiative is, it's now a global body where we're enabling companies to set ambitious reduction targets in line with science. The founding partners are CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF, and we also work in collaboration with the We Mean Business Coalition. And our goal is to make science-based target setting standard practice around the world. Next slide. So what is a science-based target? So science-based targets tell us how much and how fast companies need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to align with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Since 2015, when we launched the initiative, the focus has been on these near-term 5 to 10-year targets, which are the most critical targets to drive near-term action, and these are the targets that are accountable and that provide action, that are actionable and provide accountability. But with the launch of the Net Zero standard, we're expanding our focus now to also enable the setting of these long-term science-based net zero targets. Next slide. We're making great progress with the uptake of science-based targets. We have now over 2,000 companies that have made a commitment to set science-based targets, with almost half of those with a commitment to the highest level of ambition of 1.5. And almost half of them now have had their targets validated by the initiative. We have about now 100 companies joining per month, and we're seeing exponential growth since the initiative was launched. In 2020, we completed our first annual report of the initiative to assess the progress that we're making. And we're seeing that companies are reducing their emissions on average about 6.4% per year. And collectively, they're reducing emissions 25% between 2015 and 2020. And this is compared with an increase that we're seeing in global emissions from energy and industrial emissions. So we're seeing that companies that are setting science-based targets are meeting them and meeting them ahead of schedule, or on the path to meeting them ahead of schedule. So now I'll turn this over to Andres to talk about how the Net Zero standard was developed.
Thanks for leading us into that, Cynthia. And in the next slides, which I'm going to keep brief, I'm just going to provide a little bit of overview about why the SBTi has developed the Net Zero standard. You've already heard this from our excellent panelists this morning, so I'll keep it quite brief, but it all boils down to the science of net zero at the global level, which is quite simple. To understand it, we can take a look at the state of things today. Our economy is associated with a deep emissions footprint. Most of this comes from burning fossil fuels, plowing down forests, and feeding a growing population. And the imbalance between the amount of emissions released into the atmosphere and the amount that is absorbed every year results in a net accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And over decades, this accumulation has acted like a heat blanket that warms the planet. Next slide, please. To halt global warming, we know that at the very minimum, there's a need to reach a balance between human-caused emissions and removals. This is a state known as net zero emissions, and due to the clarity of the science, this is really our starting point for the standard. Next slide. But it's not enough to just reach net zero emissions. We know that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions no later than 2050, and there are very near-term implications to this goal. As many of you know, with near-term SBTs that are 5 to 10-year targets, companies do need to cut emissions very quickly in the near term, contributing to halving CO2 emissions by around 2030. And this is because global warming is a function of cumulative emissions, not just the emissions in any given year. Next slide. The science behind aiming for 1.5 degrees was laid out quite clearly by Doreen and some of our other panelists. Of course, the goal of 1.5 degrees was included in the Paris Agreement for a reason, but with the IPCC's publication of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees in 2018, the case for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees became even clearer. This is because the impacts associated with 1.5 degrees of warming are worse than had been previously acknowledged, but it's also clear that going just a few tenths of a degree higher makes those impacts much, much worse. And this slide is really just the very beginning. Despite understanding the severity of climate change impacts, the truth is that current policies only put us on track to limit warming to around 3 degrees, which would be a devastating outcome. The silver lining that you can't see here is that when you include country level net zero targets in pledges, this projected warming goes down closer to 2 degrees. So already, if we deliver on the pledges and targets at a country level for net zero, we're making a huge amount of progress. When you factor in commitments and targets from non-state actors, we feel that there is potential to make an even bigger leap in terms of bridging the gap. Next slide. Since the release of the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees in 2018, there's been rapid growth in the adoption of net zero pledges. We know that these pledges cover a very large proportion of global emissions, GDP, and the world population. And specifically for net zero targets that cover businesses, financial institutions, cities, states, and regions, the growth in the UN FCCC's Race to Zero campaign has been quick and massive, as you can see on this slide in the right. And the SBTi's net zero standard that we're publishing today is focused on business net zero targets, which in that chart you can see actually has the highest growth of all. Next slide. Despite all of this, there has been some very valid criticism of net zero targets that came before the SBTi's net zero standard. And this is because even though some net zero targets really were headed in the right direction and were trying to address climate impact in the right way, net zero targets varied in many ways that made them hard to understand, and not all targets could be relied upon. Some of the ways that net zero targets differed were in terms of the scope of climate impacts covered, the boundary of targets and whether they cover a company's scope 1 and 2 emissions, or the full value chain, or somewhere in between. The extent to which these targets relied on emissions reductions versus negative emissions, or offsets, or even avoided emissions, and also the time frame of targets. There have been criticisms that net zero targets allow companies to delay action by looking further into the future. In the next section, we're going to lay out how the net zero standard that we've developed really tries to address and resolve these criticisms by increasing transparency, setting a common set of requirements and expectations, and making it much clearer for business leaders and all kinds of stakeholders to drive forth climate action toward the 1.5-degree goal and reaching net zero CO2 by 2050.
Thank you, Andres, for that. So I'm going to walk you through the process that the SBTi went through to develop the net zero standard. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the net zero standard was developed through a very robust and transparent stakeholder process that took place over the past year and even before then. The process is based on and built upon the ISEAL standard setting code of good practice and the GHG protocol standard setting process. A key piece of the development of the standard is really our expert advisory group that provided direction to develop the process. It's a group of experts from academia, civil society, science, and business, some of which you heard from earlier today during the panel. And they ensured that there were differing views and perspectives that were taken into account through this process, providing input and critique along the way. We also engaged regularly with the SBTi's own technical advisory group and the scientific advisory group, consulting on technical aspects, including scenarios to determine the residual emissions and the target setting methods. Next slide, please. So a key part of this standard development process is really making sure that we're integrating as much stakeholder feedback throughout the entire process as possible. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the actual timeline of the standard development process. We kicked off the project a little over a year ago with the publication of the Net Zero Foundation's paper. And then we set up the expert advisory group that I just described to you and began meeting with them on various topics that we then used to draft the initial set of criteria. We then released that first criteria to the public for public consultation to get feedback on the concepts and on the implementation. And we received over 400 comments on that from respondents in over 37 countries. We then took that feedback in and provided these documents for companies to actually implement and provide feedback on a practical implementation level. So 84 companies over the summer took a deeper look into our criteria, guidance, and tool to make sure that it was as robust as possible. Then taking that feedback again, we released a new set of materials. Just last month, we closed that second public consultation and we received 167 responses from that. And that brings us to today, where we're happy to launch the Net Zero Standard and explain more of the criteria to you in more detail. Next slide, please. There are a number of materials that are released and that are part of the Net Zero Standard. The first one is our Getting Started guide. So this is a quick, simple, step-by-step flowchart that allows companies to understand how are they going to set a net zero target through SBTi. Then we have the SBTi Corporate Net Zero Standard. So this is where most of the documentation is. You have the guidance, the criteria, and the recommendations that support corporates in setting their net zero targets. Then we have the standalone SBTi Corporate Net Zero Criteria, where we outline the criteria that companies need to meet in order to be approved by the SBTi. And then finally, we have the Net Zero tool. And this is a target setting tool to calculate long-term science-based targets in line with the Net Zero Standard. Next slide, please. And then finally, to provide a little bit more context and background on the Net Zero Standard, we have two additional useful resources.
one of which we've mentioned before is the Net Zero Foundations paper that was published a year ago, outlining conceptual foundations for credible science-based net zero targets. And then we're also releasing the Pathways to Net Zero paper. So this is a more technical summary, and it provides an overview of how the SBTi selected its mitigation pathways to steer action. And it was produced in collaboration with more of a dozen academics, IPCC lead authors, and mitigation experts through the SBTi team and the various advisory groups. All of these materials can be found on the SBTi Net Zero webpage now, so we encourage you to start taking a look and diving deeper into our materials. And with that, I'm going to hand it back so we can take a look a little bit more into what it means to set a science-based net zero target.
Thank you so much, Paulina, and thank you to everyone who's joined the call today. So I am just going to walk you through some slides that talk about what a science-based net zero target is in accordance with the net zero standard. So if we could go on to, thank you very much. So essentially, there are 4 key elements that make up the net zero standard framework. So the first of these is a near-term science-based target. Now, this is essentially, if you're already familiar with science-based targets, this is what you'll already know as just a science-based target, but we've added near-term to add a bit more specificity as part of the net zero standard. So these are 5 to 10 year emission reduction targets in line with 1.5C pathways. And again, if you're already familiar with science-based targets, you'll know that currently science-based targets can have a time frame of 5 to 15 years and can also be aligned with well below 2C. So these near-term science-based targets as part of the net zero standard represent a ramp up in ambition. If we go on to the next slide, please. The second element, sorry, if we go back one, thank you. So the second element of the net zero standard framework is a long-term science-based target. Now, this is the new part of science-based targets. And essentially, this shows companies how much they need to reduce their emissions to be in line with global net zero scenarios that limit warming to 1.5C. Now, these targets have to be achieved by no later than 2050. And for most companies, this actually means that they're going to be reducing their emissions by 90% or more. The exception to this, and I think Doreen put this quite nicely in her presentation as well, is that in the land sector, this is going to be more around 80% minimum as well. And that's because there are some emissions in that sector that are just pretty much impossible to abate. So they're going to have slightly different requirements, but for companies outside of the land sector, the emission reductions expected from a long-term science-based target is going to be about 90%. If we go on to the next slide, please. So the third element of the net zero standard framework is a recommendation rather than a requirement. However, it's really critical in the near term to scale up finance that supports climate mitigation. So we're highly recommending that companies take action outside and on top of their science-based targets to mitigate emissions beyond their value chains. So this is essentially the kind of net of net zero and often called offsetting, but we're looking at it with a new term and a kind of a wider view. Some examples of how a company can do this are by purchasing high quality jurisdictional REDD+ credits. So if you're looking for more information on that, I would recommend looking at perhaps the LEAF Coalition or investing in carbon dioxide removal technologies such as direct air capture and storage that need to scale up in order to be able to meet the requirements that are needed in the long term. If we go on to the next slide, thank you very much. So the final element of the net zero standard framework is that when companies then reach their long-term science-based target, they must neutralize any emissions that remain with carbon removals. So for some companies, they may reach 100% emission reductions by this point, and they won't be required to neutralize any remaining emissions, but many companies will be required to do that. So that's the fourth and final element of the standard. If we go on to the next slide, please, I'll talk you through some of the considerations that you should keep in mind when setting near and long-term science-based targets. So the first of these, and you'll see these reflected in both our version 5 of the Science-Based Targets Initiative criteria and the Net Zero standard criteria. So the first thing that companies need to be thinking about is the boundary of their targets. So what coverage is required within their target boundary? So for near-term science-based targets, companies need to be including 95% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And if their scope 3 emissions are over 40% of their total footprint, they need to then include 67% of their emissions. And this does apply to most companies. In the long term, companies have to include 95% of scope 1 and 2 emissions again. So that's the same as near-term science-based targets. But for scope 3, this boundary coverage has increased to 90%. And I'll talk you through a bit more about why this has happened in the next slide. The second thing that companies need to be thinking about is the ambition level of their targets. So essentially, what is the temperature goal that your company is aiming for when setting its science-based target? So for near-term science-based targets that align with the net zero standard, scope 1 and 2 near-term targets need to align with 1.5C. So currently, companies can still set well below 2C targets. That's being phased out by July next year. But in order to align with the net zero standard now, you have to set a target aligned with 1.5C. For scope 3, recognizing the challenges around scope 3, that's a slightly lower ambition level, and companies have to set scope 3 near-term targets aligned with well below 2C. When we're looking at the long-term science-based targets and that are part of a net zero commitment, all scopes have to align with 1.5C. The third thing that we need to think about is the time frame of targets. So a near-term science-based target has to align with a 5 to 10 year time frame, as I explained in the previous slides. And the long-term science-based target has to align with 2050 or earlier. Some sectors, in particular the power sector, that's a little bit earlier. So power sector has to have a minimum time frame of 2040. And then finally, the thing that companies need to think about are the methods that they're going to use to model their science-based targets. So there are many different methods that the Science-Based Targets Initiative offer, and some of these are even sector-specific as well. And I won't go through them all in detail, but one thing I would perhaps point out is that some of these methods are for scope 3 targets only. So some can apply to all scopes, but some are just for scope 3. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm just going to talk a bit more about the scope 3 boundary requirements that I mentioned earlier. And just to reiterate, so in the near term, scope 3 targets have to cover a 67% boundary. However, in the long term, science-based targets need to include a 90% boundary. And really, through the very extensive stakeholder engagement process that we did, and also the research that we did, we found that a comprehensive target boundary that included all value chain emissions was really critical to make credible net zero claims. However, we really understand that scope 3 comes with a lot of challenges around data collation, around influence. There's many different challenges that come with scope 3. So that's why we're taking this expansive boundary approach, increasing the level of coverage over time. Now, the concept of radical collaboration was mentioned a few times during the panel, and we think that this really provides the opportunity for companies to collaborate across the whole value chain with their suppliers and their customers. But in the near term, it allows them to focus on the most material emission sources and gives them a bit more time to work through the complexity that comes with scope 3. Great, if we're going to, thank you. So through the net zero standard development process, we identified a few challenges that we feel need further work. And so we're planning on 3 specific projects to tackle these after the launch of the standard. So the first of these is looking at that beyond value chain mitigation piece. We found that it's really, really important that companies have a lot more clarity around how to take really credible mitigation actions beyond their value chain. So at the moment, we're exploring different models, how we can incentivize companies to do this in a really credible and robust way. And we plan to communicate more on this in Q1 next year. The second project that we have planned is around addressing the challenges of scope 3. So we understand, as I explained earlier, that there's a huge amount of challenge around scope 3. And what we want to do is further develop the scope 3 target setting methods that we have, but also explore some other different approaches to drive net zero value chain alignment. Finally, and thinking about the criticism point around net zero targets not having that accountability piece to them, we are going to be looking at developing a measurement, reporting, and verification standard after the launch of the standard as well. So that will really help ensure much more transparent and accountable plans that companies have around achieving their science-based targets and their net zero targets as well. And so with that, I will pass back to Cynthia, who is going to take us through the acknowledgements and appreciation for all the stakeholders that have been involved. Thank you very much.
So we want to thank the more than 800 stakeholders that participated in our standard setting process. Couldn't do that adequately through slides, so we prepared a video here that we're going to show now. Okay, and next slide. And the next slide. And now we'd like to make a call to action to have to drive the uptake of net zero targets. And we're hoping in the coming years, we'll have tens of thousands of companies setting both these near-term and long-term science-based targets. In January, we officially start validating these long-term net zero targets. We're now starting a new system for validation where companies use a booking system to reserve their slot to get their target validated. And this third-party assurance or independent assurance from the SBTi can provide companies with the added credibility and confidence that their target meets the best practices criteria that we've developed to define net zero targets. Next slide. And now we're urgently calling on all companies to set science-based net zero targets. We already have 600 companies that have committed to net zero through the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign. And if you want to make this commitment now, you can sign our SBTi commitment letter that you can find on our website. And now I'll turn it back to Paula.
Yes, thanks, Cynthia. Thank you, Cynthia, Emma, Paulina, Andres, for that very helpful overview of the SBTi and the net zero standard. We are now about to start the second to last part of today's agenda, and we are really glad to have today a representative from GLL's company who had, as you saw in the previous video, its net zero target approved by the SBTi during the pilot phase. And well, we hope that you enjoy this case study and that inspires you. We have Richard Batten, Global Chief Sustainability Officer, with us. So I will hand it over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Paolo. And good day, afternoon, evening to all of you. Thank you very much, first of all, to SBTi for giving us the opportunity to be talking to you today. This is really what I do want to cover, but when we start looking at something like the commitments, we're hearing a lot about commitments at the moment. I'll explain our journey, which is what I've been asked to do. What is our transition to net zero? What is the journey? How have we got to where we are at the moment? But then also to look at the pathways that will hopefully ensure that we achieve the standard at the end, and also what sort of actions are we going to take in order to get there. But before I do that, and if we can move on, please, can I first of all say something about who are JLL? Next slide, if we could, please. Well, JLL is a leading professional services firm specializing in real estate, providing real estate services and property management to our clients. We operate in over 60 countries around the world, and we've got a workforce of over 95,000 people. So that gives you something of the sort of scale, what we do. This is our purpose. We shape the future of real estate for a better world. And with the built environment responsible for up to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, we can have a very large impact on that figure going forward. So we feel we're in a good place to have that impact through working particularly with our clients. And I'll be talking about that in more detail as we go forward. But if let's look at the journey. I said we'd look at the journey to where we've got to. We started out making our first carbon emission reduction commitments back in 2009. But the journey really began in 2018 when we started looking at science-based targets, because it probably wasn't until then that we achieved the rigor, the discipline of data collection, and that was required to meet the science-based target standards. And from that, we were able to then create reliable baselines to work from, and then set credible pathways. For us, the journey was one of small steps, incremental steps, breaking the target. when you start looking at it at the outset, well, I was certainly intimidated by it. It's a big, big task to look at. But if you break it down into small bite-sized pieces, we found that we were then able to move into a set of manageable work streams for each of the areas that we needed to be focusing on. And we then went forward to SBTi, submitted, and were finally approved in 2020, which meant that we were then on the road to emission reduction in a serious and science-backed way. So where does that now put us? Because being put on the road was fine, but can we improve on where we started? And if we could have the next slide, please. This is where we now stand as at today. Science-based, and we are now able to make a more ambitious science-based commitment to net zero across all three scopes, committing to be net zero by 2040, and also limiting ourselves, as you can see there, to 5% neutralization. So that is the target we've set. You can also see up here our footprint. And like many other service companies, totally dominated by scope 3. And we're going to spend a bit more time just having a look at that in a moment. But I'll let you have a look at that. But the client emissions are those buildings that we manage on behalf of our clients for them. If we're a reasonably sized company globally, we act on behalf of our clients who occupy space 1,500 times the amount of space we ourselves occupy. So that is where that impact on the built environment comes from. I have been asked, why aren't we just happy to do 2050 as a target in accordance with the SBTi? Why are we not just giving ourselves some headroom on the 90%? When we first did the figures, we did all the calculations to 2050 and to 90%, because that was what was coming along. But we felt that having done that we could actually be more ambitious. And we believe that this target that we've set ourselves within that science-based calculation of SBTi is achievable, and that is the one that we're working towards now. Right, if we move on to the next, please. Next slide. So let's look at, this is the amalgamated pathway. Near-term targets, and as we've also said, 2030, and for us calculated down a reduction of 51% by 2050 to ensure that we get to our 95% by 2040. I would also say, if we just go back one, I'd also say that throughout this whole process, there needs to be accountability, because it's all very well having the plans, but you need to prove that you're actually making the journey in accordance with the pathways and the milestones that are being set. We have an external carbon audit that signs off on our emissions each year, and we report that annually in our sustainability report that is up on our website. So all of this is very much open to, is fully transparent if anybody wants to have a look at it. Right, if we've made our commitments and we've got some pathways in place across all of the categories, all of the scopes, what are the sort of things we need to do in order to achieve it? Because I think we also need to be talking about actions. So if we go on to the next slide now then, please, let's break down some of our scopes, some of our emissions into the various areas. Our own office space in those 60 odd countries, 400 offices or whatever, is mainly, it says 1, 2, and 3, but it's primarily scope 2. That is the actions we need to take there are fairly clear. We're actually focusing on a 2030 net zero in our own office space. That's our target internally. And that is, a large part of that is just reducing the amount of energy we're using, energy efficiencies, either by retrofitting the efficiencies in existing buildings, and bearing in mind that 80% of the buildings in the developed world today, 80% will still be standing in 2050. Retrofit is going to be a huge part of what we're doing. But also, when we're able to take on new space, then we'll only be taking on that space which is green accredited. And that will be a big part, and is a big part of our real estate strategy as we go forward. And then obviously, we'll be moving into renewables as we can, or purchasing the RECs or their equivalent where they are still unavailable. The second part, well, our scope 1 area is primarily our vehicles. This is in the US and in Europe, and it's mainly mobile engineering, driving about in white vans. And that particular portfolio, we are looking to be fully EV by 2032. Yes, like all of these things, there's upfront cost in achieving this, but there's long-term savings as you pan it out over the period going forward, and on vehicles especially, and significantly reduced fuel costs if you're using electric. The big issues, and for all of us, as I said before, is probably our scope 3, and the biggest part of that are the clients' emissions from the buildings we're managing. And this, I've heard the word collaboration, and I've got it littered over some of what I was going to say today, but I probably can't emphasize the need for collaboration enough. And I just love the word radical collaboration, which is something I haven't used before, but I certainly will be as going forward. But this is where we need to collaborate with our clients to help them. Because remember, our scope 3 is somebody else's scope 2. And they need help in driving those emissions down because they want to and need to drive those down. So again, similar to our scopes, driving energy efficiencies, moving into renewables where we can, and also making use of new technology, which is becoming ever more coming to the fore. And we ourselves are certainly investing into new green prop tech going forward to try to actually improve the ability and the efficiency of the buildings we're in and our clients are in as well. So if that's the biggest piece, there are some tricky scope 3 areas that and these ones here, we left a 5% neutralization area within our targets, and it's probably because of these ones here, where a business such as ours still has to travel. We were fortunate to be able to reduce air travel down by 80% in 2020, and I had to ask the question, who was the 20% still traveling during 2020, but that will inevitably come back. Hopefully, we will have made savings, permanent savings, through a greater becoming more and more accustomed to working virtually. We do not need to travel everywhere, but that will still continue. There will be a decarbonization of aviation fuels. Of course, there will over that period, but we don't think they will be eliminated, and we've made an allowance for that. Like we've heard from a number of people today, supply chain is a significant issue for us. Again, this is going to have to be, you see the word there, collaboration again with our suppliers to set shared targets. So this is to collaborate with them to help. The issue for us with our suppliers is really the identification, devising a means of actually identifying what carbon is sitting in the services they're providing. And that is, it's easier, not totally easy, on product, which is coming into the offices, but more particular, it's difficult in the provision of services into us. And if we could actually get the carbon related to the suppliers more accurately identified, then I think that will be the first task, and then it will be easier to drive that down in a transparent manner. Data centers, we've spoken to a number of data center providers. They do not see a problem with moving over to renewables by 2040, and that is a common response from them. So we're quite confident there. For the first time in 2020, we started looking at home working footprint, and we can refine our measurements there. We can also refine the measurement of our employee commuting. But in respect of both of those, we definitely believe that there will be, while public transport will be decarbonised, again, we are expecting there to be some residual emissions that we will have to take into account. Right, if we could now move on to the last slide, I think, please. If I could just make some final points here. A company like JLL has numerous stakeholders, and they're all important in directing us, guiding us, making us think what is the right thing to be doing, and taking on more and more ambitious goals. Now, those stakeholders could be shareholders, and certain shareholders are certainly more and more activist in this space at the moment, which I think is great. Our clients, I've already said that we have to collaborate with our clients, and that helps us in the same way as hopefully it helps our clients too. And finally, our own people. Close to 60% of our staff at the moment are Y and Z Gen. So they have ambitions for themselves and also for their employers. And we actually need those high ambitions to attract them in the first place and then to subsequently retain. As I look forward now with COP coming up, one corporate or one country, and we'll hear a lot about commitments coming up over the next couple of weeks, but one of anything is not going to do it. We all need to achieve net zero if the world is actually going to be that better place. And based on the science, rather than commitments that are pulled out without with a total lack of consistency. So today, it's thanks to the SBTi that we do have a science-backed target, which will hopefully create consistency going forward. A standard that will help us all to achieve that 2050 target. And to finish up, I would urge all corporates to really embrace the target, and let's all do it together. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you to SBTi for setting it up in the first place and for giving us the guidance to be able to get on this journey. So back to you, Paula.
Richard, many thanks for sharing JLL's impressive and courageous climate journey. Definitely an inspiration for all the companies listening to today's event. And thank you so much for encouraging others. I think the message is clear. We need to do this together. So thank you so much for sharing that. Congratulations on your new targets. And now the real challenge begins. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually, we are now wrapping up just on time. I think today's event. Thank you so much for staying the 2 hours. It has been amazing to listen to all of our panelists, our speakers. So thank you so much. Well, I think I want to start by saying that we are thrilled with the high level of attendance at this event today. We have more than, I think, 5,000 people. So thank you so much for tuning in. As well, many thanks to the SBTi. There is a lot of work behind this event, and many thanks to our moderators and panelists, as I said, Patrick, Doreen, Emily, Michael, Carol, Nora. We greatly appreciate your support. Richard, thank you so much. We are aware that we didn't manage to cover a lot of the technical aspects of the NetZero standard. There's a lot to learn. So I would like to encourage you to find out more on our NetZero webpage. All the materials are available as of today there. It's freshly updated. So please don't hesitate to also contact us if you have any questions. And anyhow, we will also have the opportunity to have more trainings and events where we will have the chance to have Q&As and discuss the technical aspects of the NetZero standard in the coming months. So further details to come. I would just want to reinforce our call to action to commit today to setting a NetZero target. And as Cynthia mentioned, you can commit today, but then once you're ready with modeling your targets, you can also book your validation slot via our new booking system. But today you can already commit. So we really encourage you to do that. And finally, I think I would just like to end this amazing event today with thanking you all for your attendance. This is really a landmark moment. As you saw, it is not only the SBTi behind this. We have hundreds of people that provided us input and feedback to the standard. So this is a standard for the world, and it's out there. So now together we have to bring it to life. So thank you so much. Gracias. Obrigada.